Welcome to the Supercharge Marketing Podcast. I'm Pius, the head of growth at Lumen 5, an AI video creator made by marketers for marketers. This podcast is a rally call for those who believe in purposeful content, brand storytelling, and thought leadership. We feature insights and best practices from forward-thinking marketers and B2B leaders, daring you to stand out in the rapidly evolving world around us. Are you ready to supercharge your marketing? Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Supercharge Marketing. I'm your host, Pius Chan, and with me today is Cheryl Martel from Egon Zehnder, a global leadership advisory and management consulting firm. Now, Egon Zehnder is one of the world's largest privately held executive talent organizations with over 2,300 employees and 600 consultants. And they have been very selective in their content strategy, led by Cheryl, and intentional in what content they put out, what they repurpose, and what channels they work in, leading to massive and successful engagement rates. Cheryl is the global head of content there with experiences across strategy and all things content marketing, driving editorial and educational leadership content for an executive audience. Cheryl, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm super excited to dive into your experiences in all things content and going into new global markets. Maybe we can kick off with a little bit about yourself and how you got into your role today.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I've always been a bit of a storyteller. I started my career as a journalist way back when, and then pivoted to a little bit more of PR and more generalized communications, and then had a little bit of a strange, sharp right into content for events, specifically for corporate directors, which I never thought I'd be saying or have done. But it was one of the most rewarding experiences to really think about what's the most relevant for some of the biggest decision makers out there in business. So it's a sharp right that I'm glad I took. And then I moved to Egon Zehnder about 4 years ago, and that felt like a little bit more of a return to my roots, to come back into content, really focusing on storytelling. My former boss was a big draw for the reason I came in. She was also a former journalist, and getting to work from her and learn from her and really see her take on strategy in a management consulting firm was really refreshing. And so I've tried to take on to some of her coattails of what she's put in there and then build on that.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I love these stories where you do start off as a storyteller, kind of pivot around and you come back to your roots. That's amazing to hear. Now, kind of driving that right type of content for your audience, and especially working with an executive one and a global one, can't be an easy task. What do you and your team focus on when it comes to content and storytelling?
So, like a lot of organizations out there today, we try to really be guided by our purpose. And for us, that's leadership for a better world. And what I do is break that down and personalize it and then turn that into a bigger content strategy. So for me, when I think about who's sitting in those leadership seats, CEOs, board members, other members of the C-suite, the decisions they make for and what their companies do have these massive ramifications and trickle down effects for all of us. And so the more those leaders are confident and informed, the better the outcomes for you, for me, and for all of us. And so I think in terms of going to that audience, you've got to come in at a certain caliber because these are really seasoned people. They don't typically look for advice. So we have to give it in a way that feels relevant. And I think part of that is our consultants are hired in a really intentional way. They are all former industry leaders themselves. So they've faced a lot of these challenges. They know what it's like to sit in some of those seats. And so we like to make sure that comes through in the content. So there's obviously a lot of thought leadership out there. And what I really try to infuse is let's have a perspective, let's have an opinion. And it doesn't have to be the most inflammatory, persuasive opinion out there, but let's have a view. These consultants have worked in different regions, different size companies, they've worked with founders, they've worked with really seasoned CEOs. Let's have a perspective. Let's not be afraid to say something because what's out there a lot, and I see this when I try to look at what's the white space on topics, everyone's just kind of regurgitating different versions of things. And it's not to say I don't do that, because sometimes we do too. But it's really that push. Let's actually have something to say. And it doesn't have to be said in this fanning the flames way, but let's have a real view. And I think that's what cuts through a lot of the noise of what's out there.
I love that. Yeah. First of all, that purpose, leadership for a better world, is an amazing one to drive towards. But that true thought leadership with real subject matter experts that have done it, they've been in that seat, and they really have perspective and an opinion stance to stand by. That really cuts through and kind of drives the audiences to your content as well. When it comes to sharing strategies in an educational way, one thing that marketers always think about is how much do you share, what do you share, what do you not share, and how important is teaching in a lot of ways. What do you think about that?
I think we're all better when we're transparent and we learn from each other.
Mhm.
Um, I think if you had me sitting down with two of my counterparts and our major competitors, I might say something a little different, or I'd at least be a little bit more. I'd be a little bit more thoughtful. But at
Mhm.
the end of the day, we're all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to grow. We're trying to work on our bottom lines. We're trying to do good for the world. And so, the more we share, I think the more we can get out of it, especially when you're looking at someone who's maybe working in an entirely different industry than you, entirely different market. I think it helps to share because you can sit there and think, on the outside it might not feel like this is applicable, but usually there's something at the core. There's always something that you can take away. And so I think the more we share, the better we're all going to be. And that might intensify the competition, but I think that's okay.
Yeah, and when you're I guess when you're taking a perspective and an opinion on something and a stance on something, what is that thing that drives that thought behind that piece? Is it how do you decide which side to lean towards, or what opinion to share, or does that come out naturally with the consultants that you work with?
Everyone's a little bit different, as you can imagine. So sometimes a consultant will have a really clear idea of what they want to do and how they want to do it. However, they might not have always taken into account different marketing strategies. They might not have looked into how much is already out there. Who is this going out to? And I think honestly, defining the audience, I think, is a lot of this because lots of people come in and say, "Oh, I'd like this to get published in HBR." Wouldn't we all? It's a selective. They're very selective. You've got to be really specific with what you go to them with, and so knowing who the audience is, I think, is gets overlooked a lot. I know I sort of at one point I just felt like kind of a content shop. It was sort of the McDonald's drive-through. People came through, they said, "I want to produce something on AI, I want to produce something on CMOs." And I said, "Okay, let's figure out how to do this the quickest way possible and push it out." But I don't know if that ever did us any good. I think stopping and really thinking, who is this actually for? And if it's for a smaller audience, that's okay. I would rather hit with a small percentage of people and have those people engage versus I put it out to the masses and it didn't really land for anybody because it wasn't targeted enough. And so that's usually a big part of the conversation. Let's figure out the audience, and then also let's figure out the channels, because one of the things that I really wanted to add over the last 2 years at our firm was we we were still using the term white paper a lot, which doesn't make anybody want to read anything, even me. So we've had to really reframe that and think, here's what people are reading. We know people are spending less and less time. Let's think about these formats. And so the first iteration of that was really, okay, let's get something and put it on the website. So, we called it articles because I think people didn't like the term blog post in our firm. So we started with a lot of web articles, and then obviously we were using those for social media, and then we started to morph a little bit, and we realized, okay, some of these pieces, they're not going to be a whole article. They're a post on LinkedIn, they're an infographic, let's do that. But then we kind of had a gap because we'd have content and it wasn't necessarily enough for an article, but it was too much for a post on LinkedIn, which is our primary channel. And so that's where we started making videos. And that's where we really found a sweet spot, I think, because we know people watch videos more. We know it's catches people's attention as they're scrolling through all of their feeds. And you know, not only do they work nicely on social media, but they're a great standalone. We've been using them. We've been getting back into the habit of hosting events, and it's great for event summaries because people don't need to relive the whole thing. They don't need to read a whole summary, but 60 seconds, 90 seconds of a video that gives them the high points, that's kind of the sweet spot.
That's amazing. Yeah, I guess you have found that middle ground between that long form white paper and the short social posts where the video contracts you to both, and the video gives you an eye to what the long form white paper is, or maybe not white paper per se, but the long form content is that drives eyes back to that eventually if they're interested enough in the video.
It does, and it's good for repurposing too. Anything that's something, podcasts, if you've got something, a longer written piece, we try to repurpose on video a second time around. And it comes together quickly, and we get essentially about the same amount of engagement that we did with the first piece. So it's hitting people with different formats, I think is important.
Yeah, one thing you said earlier that really caught my eye was the audience first and channel second. When you kind of understanding your audience and then understanding what channels they're in and searching for what type of content, how do you determine which channels to go into and how do you choose which channels to focus on?
So for us, we're typically looking at that very top of the house when it comes to leadership. So it is the board, it is CEOs, and it's other C-suite members. So we have to really think about what channels are they on, and for us, it is primarily LinkedIn when it comes to social. We do post on Twitter. You'll see a little bit on Instagram, but the Instagram has to be obviously really visual. That's I would say on Instagram, it's a little bit more of sort of life at Egon Zehnder, where it's things that are happening in our different offices, initiatives that have taken place, events that we're holding. That's a little bit more, I would say, of employee engagement type of channel. But LinkedIn is the primary channel for our client and candidate audience. And so we spend a lot of time thinking, what are they going to look at while they're on here? The other piece of it is we do a lot of our content sharing really one to one. And by that, I mean our consultants reaching out to those clients and candidates because that's kind of what our firm is built on. It really is that high touch, really personalized engagement. We're not going to blast you with emails. That's just not what we do. It's not what we've ever done. I sometimes wish it's what we did because I would love another vehicle. But it's been something that our firm has really been grounded in, and there's something about that deepening relationships that comes from that. The downside for me as a marketer is I don't always get the data that I want because when it's happening on that one-to-one level, I'm very reliant on anecdotes and consultants coming back to tell me what the outcome is. And sometimes the outcome doesn't happen for months down the line because it's this long lead up to saying, especially if we're going to do something with CEOs, if someone wants to hire us for CEO succession planning, that's one of the most important things a company's ever going to do, decide who their next leader is. And they're not going to just call up the next person who comes into their inbox. Like that's a long lead up. And so the content I like to think is part of the journey, but because it's this one to one and it's very relationship driven, I don't always get all the information about what's leading up to that end step.
Yeah, that there's two sides to that stone, I guess, and one of the things that we're seeing a lot of within our market base, and our customers are primarily marketers, and our audience is primarily marketers, is this thing where now it's very much a marketing led buyer's journey, where marketers need to think one to one, and the content they're sharing needs to be hyper personalized to this person who they're trying to reach at the time they want to see it across multiple channels now that you can put your content out into, and these buyers are at different mindsets when they're surfing on different channels. Like you said, with Instagram, when I'm on TikTok, I'm thinking I'm the same person, but I have two different mindsets when I'm on these things, so the content needs to match. And I think it's becoming more and more difficult to get that hyper personalized one-to-one content when you're trying to scale, right, when you're trying to go wide and whatnot, and that high touch engagement is really tough. How do you focus on that, and where does the time come from your team to focus so much on these one-to-one engagements?
So the time is always in short supply.
Yes.
When it comes to content, I'm essentially a content team of two. It's me and my colleague Louisa, who is outstanding, and the two of us produce the bulk of the firm's content.
Wow.
So it's all of those articles on the website, it's the social media posts, it's the videos. We have a small number of freelancers that we do bring in, but because we're so specific about what we do, there's really two or three of them that we rely on. Our team is a little bit larger than that. There's about 12 of us that are full time, spread out across the U.S., Europe, and Latin America. But the timing makes it tough. It's two people, and essentially we have 600 bosses worldwide, and thankfully not everybody's coming at the same time. I think one thing that's been to our benefit is different regions, I think, are in different stages of their maturity in terms of how much content they want to produce. We're starting to see more of a ramp up. I would say in Asia, I would say more of a ramp up in Latin America than we'd had before, which is great. But luckily, not everybody is banging down our door at once. And so when it comes to that segmentation, we've just had to really be focused and be transparent and say, this is the bandwidth we've got. How does this map back to growing? Basically, one thing I should probably mention at the outset is the US is one of our growth markets. And so we have to really come and think about everything that we're doing, even if we're producing something for a consultant that's happening in Sweden. We have to sit there and think, how does this apply globally? Can we replicate whatever this is in another region? What would need to change? And so part of it, I think, is just being thoughtful about, here's what we've got. Do we always have to create something from scratch? People would say yes, that's what they would like my answer to be. But because there's two of us, we have to think broadly. We're also probably the only two people in our firm who have that view of everything that's being published, everything that's in the pipeline, everything that has been published in the last 5 years. We're going to know that. And so we're able to kind of build, repurpose, and try to repackage things. I think if we were trying to create something bespoke constantly, I would have to really try to clone both of us multiple times over.
Yeah, so that's a great kind of move into onto the next topic that we can dive into. And one thing that marketers are always trying to do is expand our market reach and audiences. And with you leading a global strategy, maybe you could kind of share with us some ways that you're doing that and growing into new markets, new regions like the US, and how you're repurposing it and finding that right content to reuse and repurpose.
Yeah, so it's definitely a change of voice, I think, when it comes to different regions. With the US being our growth market, one of our consultants has said, everybody who knows us loves us. So now everybody needs to know us. And so that's been that's been a bit of our marketing remit. Okay, everyone, this is kind of thinking still that very top of the marketing funnel in that traditional sense. How are we going to make sure people know us? Which quite frankly, in the US, I think our biggest impediment was that we didn't have first mover advantage. We're a private Swiss company, and our major competitors are US headquartered companies. And so we've had a presence here for quite some time, but it's time for us to really focus it on the US as a big driver. To that end, we have a head of US marketing who is really charged with pooling a lot of that together. And so she's it's been quite a godsend for us. But in terms of the content, it's really been thinking about what plays where and how it plays. And it's sometimes as granular as word choices. We had this sort of aha moment several years ago. We have this initiative called Leaders and Daughters, and it's a global initiative, and it's essentially leaders bringing young women in their lives to these events. And it was wonderful. Like clients really had a great time there. They felt like it felt so personal because you're bringing your children into your professional life, which is something I think a lot of kids hadn't experienced their parents in that way before. And so I think it was very eye-opening for them. But one of the pieces that got raised, Germany was never really keen to be part of this initiative. And as it turned out, leader in German doesn't translate to a great word. And so that initiative was never going to play there. And other people on the team just had never picked up on that nuance. So it's sometimes as simple as being really mindful about the language you're using. But then there's obviously the bigger strategies that come into this, where it's how are we gathering people? How are we making it? How are they experiencing us? And what do they walk away thinking about Egon Zehnder at our events? And then as we're reaching out to them with these different pieces of IP, making sure that even that outreach feels really personalized and feels really adapted. Another piece of this is we're trying to be better at translating because we sort of default to English being the global equalizer for a lot of our work, but in certain countries that doesn't really work. You know, in Brazil, I know people want to be spoken to in Portuguese. That's what they want to do, and it's the same in Italy. And so now, of course, translation is another expense, and so we've got to be mindful about how are we doing this, but also thinking if we really do want to have those impacts, then we need to meet our clients where they are, and that's speaking their native languages. And so that's been kind of a nuance that's come onto our strategy in the last year, where if we really do want to be that high touch firm and be really personalized and synced in, we can't just come at them with English. That's the complete opposite.
Hmm. Yeah, it's all these little things that you might overlook, and when you're trying to market to one market, but now when you expand to global, it's all the little things that we do need to think about as marketers. How has growing into a new market like the US been? I mean, I know you mentioned earlier the US is a growth market. How has that been going for you, and what have you been doing there that's different from maybe what you've been doing in other markets?
So I hope I'm going to do this justice because I feel like our head of US is really a little more honed into this. But when it comes to the content side of things, I think it's just being really getting our consultants to slow down and think about what we could be creating. We're really back to flexing our event muscles again in the US, which I think is a good thing. But we're trying to get people to not just think about them as, okay, we gathered a group together, because I think events are such a huge lift that once people are done, they really want to just close the door and be done with it. But you know, there's more to it. There's the follow-up email. There's a summary email. There's if we can, which also has to happen at the outset, is let's create content. Which of course we need to let people know we'd like them to either be on the record or have modified Chatham House rules. But what we find as far as content goes, people want to hear from their peers. They'll take advice from consultants, but if you're a CEO, there's nothing better than hearing from other CEOs. That's who you want to talk to. And so when we're gathering those leaders together, those insights are pure gold. And if we miss the opportunity to be able to create something from it, I just think it's such a misstep, because that's what drives people back to us. You know, we are those conveners. We can bring those relationships together, and I think letting them learn peer to peer is always preferable. And so we try to be really intentional up front, saying, okay, host this event, but don't forget about the back end, because you can create this content. It also helps you, if you want to, stay in touch. Sometimes they turn into little cohort communities afterward, because they don't always get a chance to talk to each other. And so when we create that experience, it's that, again, it's that deepening of that relationship. And it's kind of the long lead, but we found it pays off. So it's a lot of intentional step building.
Yeah, I love that. And what you say is so right. I mean, when you look at events is a lot of work to put together, and it feels like the end state, but it's really just halfway done when you look
Mhm.
at it. And the event is a great place to pull people together, to have people meet each other, build relationships, and then follow up with that with everything else that comes after. So it's a really good mindset to get into when you're building events as well. What we're also been hearing is yeah, people love to hear advice from their peers, and we're seeing technology enable that a lot. Where I think in the past it was harder to get these subject matter experts or CEOs or different types of folks together, but now technology is enabling them to meet in different communities or in different chat groups or whatnot. How have you been using technology and with tooling? And I know with a small team, it can be difficult to get everything done. And What do you and your team use to support that from that content strategy?
So I think, like a lot of organizations, the pandemic obviously opened up the Zoom meetings to the world.
Yes.
And we certainly leveraged that. In the early days of 2020, we were holding, so I think there were multiple gatherings happening every day. It was HR leaders, it was audit chairs, it was risk committee members, and it was constant. And of course, it was a bit of a panicking time. Leaders didn't know what to do. They wanted to hear what other people found was working, what wasn't working, and it was really a time that we saw people come together. And fast forward to 2023, I think we see a little bit less of that. People want to get together in person now, from what we're seeing. There really is some value to getting off the screen. That being said, when it comes to those CEOs, when it comes to the board members, it's not always feasible to get them together in person. And so, one of the events we've held recently was specifically for people of color who were new to board service, and to talk about, okay, you've made it to the board, but now what does it look like to move from board member to board leader? How do you get into that board chair role? How do you move into those committee chair roles? And this came out of actually a piece of content that we did. We do a global board diversity tracker every 2 years that tracks, it started by tracking gender on boards globally, but now it looks into race and ethnicity and LGBTQ plus as well. And when it comes back to people of color, the number, first of all, there's not that many of people of color serving on boards. That number is getting better because there are demands for it, but we're not seeing those same numbers for those leadership roles. And so, what does it take to do that? What's the role of the new member in letting people know they want to do it? But then also, let's bring in some of those people of color who have had those roles and share. And so, we've had, I think, three of those now, and it's been quite successful
That's
because it's
amazing.
this learning and mentoring experience. And then, thinking out up front, we created content from both of it. We've created videos, we created summaries, and so it's been a win. You hold one virtual event, but you get five things out of it.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I love that initiative, and also like with sharing the stories of folks who have been there and who are trying to do that, and kind of teaching the next generation of folks who are wanting to play in that space as well. One thing that we'll end our conversation on today is really tracking attribution and looking at that. And I know it's difficult to see the success of maybe a piece of content and whatnot. How do you measure success in your content, and how do you track whether a piece of content is doing well with engagement rates, or how do you measure success?
Sure. So I'm probably not going to say anything revolutionary, but for us, time on page is critical. It's not that I don't care about views. I just care more about the quality of time people are spending with us. And so we typically will see, if it's organic, people will spend on average about 2 minutes when they visit us, which I think is pretty good. Um, so we focus on that. And then when it comes to social media, we track some things there as well. And I think with social, we are careful about how often we post. I know for a lot of people, it's really a volume operation. It's how many posts can I get up in a day? How many likes do I get? How many shares do I get? We actually post less. And I wrote this down because I didn't want to forget. So last month, we posted on LinkedIn 56 times, 56 posts, and we got just under 4,000 engagements on those posts. So
Wow.
it's a pretty good return because I think there's a piece of it where we're not going to be in your feed constantly. But the thought is, when we are, it's because it is relevant to you. We're serving you things that are actually useful. It's not every little piece that's come out of our brains is now dumped into your feed. And what's cool about that is when we stack up against our major competitors, our engagement is higher than all except one, and that firm happens to be extremely large. And so it's not it's not quite an apples to apples comparison. And so I think you can do a lot with only two people when you need to. But part of it is is really being thoughtful about that strategy. It's not really a volume operation. I think the more centralized content you have and the more relevant it is, people want that. People want to feel like they can trust you. They don't want to feel like you're just spamming them with content constantly. But if it's a little bit more thoughtful, then I think when it does come through, you're that much likely to get people to more likely to get people to engage.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a huge engagement rate for such a small number of posts, and really that purpose built, that thoughtful strategy is a huge play to that. Do you engage with the I mean the people who comment and continue the conversations on those posts to drive additional engagement?
We do, but in not that often. I think it depends what the content is. Specifically, if it what we try to do is when it's something that's authored by a particular consultant, we try to engage. We try to ask them to do it because they're the author, they're tagged in the post, and so it's a nice way for them to kind of start to drive some of those relationships. And I think we had a post, I think, last month, and we were announcing new partners to the firm, and I think there was, I should know the number, but I want to say it was around 20. And so it's all those people who are tagged, and it's just wonderful to see different people who've worked with them responding in the comments. Our consultants are responding back. So it is a nice way to foster some organic back and forth. But we try to refrain from commenting as the firm and try to have those individuals, because again, that comes back to that relationship building. The individuals make up the firm, but I think you want a relationship with a person, not with a firm. And so having them respond, I think, gets that across.
I love that. Yeah, and it makes it so much more of an engaging conversation as opposed to feeling like you're just shouting from a soapbox and
Mhm.
yelling and no one's responding on everything. So that's amazing. Oh, this has been great. Thank you so much, Cheryl. This has been wildly educational and interesting as well. Where can our audience find you?
So much like our firm, LinkedIn is probably the best option. So you'll find me under Cheryl Soltis on there.
Great. Perfect. Thank you, Cheryl. Hey, listeners, we always want to keep our episodes short and impactful, and we hope you found value in what you heard today. That's our goal, really, is to connect you with industry leaders with expertise to share so we can all grow together. As always, keep making purposeful content in this B2B world, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening. Bye, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this episode, hit subscribe and rate us wherever you listen to your podcast, or leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube. If video is not already part of your marketing content strategy, it's not too late to start. Create amazing videos with Lumen 5's AI-powered video creator without the need for any design or video editing experience. Check us out at lumen5.com to supercharge your marketing, or follow us on LinkedIn for updates and resources. As always, keep making purposeful content in this B2B world. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.